Well, mate, first of all, thank you so much for your time. I'm so stoked to get the opportunity to actually speak with you about group flow and where I've kind of got to with it, and ask you a few questions. So I'm so intrigued, and I'll get into it pretty quick. But I kind of started out I closed a conference in Tasmania, which is at the bottom of Australia. And during the conference, it was basically like an extended flow experience, the whole thing. It was just, there was no drugs, no alcohol. First time I'd ever been to a festival like that. It was 5 days of everyone resonating on the vibe of, change makers in terms of like trying to save the planet, trying to level up our game as humans, trying to, affect what the future of architecture looks like, a gamut of things, like reconnecting back with Indigenous cultures in Australia. And the most powerful part of that was circle experience. So sitting around the fires, learning about history. I did a men's circle, which was the first time I'd ever done that. And so, yeah, I left that experience and I was at the airport and I was having this extended flow state, which I didn't quite understand. And it lasted for 2 to 3 weeks. And it left, and at the time I'd just come across Stealing Fire, which is Jamie and Stephen's book, obviously. And then that was where I was introduced to your group flow concept and how you'd unpack that. And so since then I've kind of gone on this journey, and now I've started working with the Flow Genome Project. And I guess what I do day to day is I guide people on how to redefine their relationships with alcohol. And that's essentially through taking them on a journey of being observant of their behavior and then deciding on where they want to get to, rather than telling people they shouldn't drink. It's more of a, self-reflective process. Every time they drink alcohol, the next day they put into my app, was it worth it? And they draw out the traits in their drinking, knock out bad ones, pump up the good ones. That's it in a nutshell. But there was a problem, and it was that the whole sort of system was online. It's like an app. It's an online education program. Everyone sort of connects online. And we were missing like the community. And so people would shift their habits, but then they'd switch back because they'd lose the community. They'd finish the program, et cetera, et cetera. And so with kind of my excitement and knowledge over the power of group circle and the way that people can solve problems in groups, at the moment, I've got this brilliant group I work with. And at the moment, we've got an election coming up in Australia. It's like our big election for who's going to be the next Prime Minister. And within 3 hours of dropping into a state of group flow with some of my smartest friends, we kind of created this concept of voting for the planet rather than voting for the politicians. And in the space of 10 days, based on group flow and continually just checking in 15 minutes each day, we've kind of gone viral. We've had sort of 200,000, well, it's viral in Australian sense, had 750 shares on like how to vote thing that we've created. We've had hundreds of thousands of impressions, and now the climate is, for the first time ever in Australia, the #1 trending topic when it comes just in the lead up to the election, which is mind-boggling because it was normally down at the bottom like 20 or something when it came to policies and things. But anyway, so the power of like getting together in a group circle and just riffing, and the way that you explain and relate it to improv theatre and jazz is just like, it's magic to me. Because with my company, we started doing these things, and sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent because the climate's on top of mind, but we started doing these things where we'd get together on a Friday night. It's kind of like a redefine your Friday night vibe, and sit around together and start talking about how alcohol has affected us, how it affects us at the moment, and how we'd like to drink, and we'd like to drink in the future, and what we'd like to see for our societies. But we just kind of gather. It's a real gathering, and I facilitate the circle. We've started to put things in place to make it a little bit, it's still improv style, but it's a little bit more like, we want to drop into a level of psychological safety so people feel like they can have these conversations. And so I've done 5 now, and through the Flow Genome Project, I've been registering people, like surveying and trying to find out, what are the things, how do we tick the boxes? And there was one event where everything just worked. And to the point where at the end of the event, it was the same. It was truly the same extended group flow experience that I'd had over the 5 days. One of the people within the group then, without prompting, went and created their own group, and has now built their own group in the city that we left, and that is growing. And so the idea of like using alcohol within sort of ceremony, within circle, within group flow, opening up the conversation at a point when normally, and I know that there's a lot of issues in the States as well, in North America, around people just getting drunk all weekend and suppressing all the things that are going on in their lives. But there's this like catharsis mixed with communitas and ecstasis, to use the Flow Genome's terminology, that occurs in circles. And this isn't new, right? This is like, if I ask someone Indigenous in Australia, they'll be like, yeah, duh, we've been doing this around the fire for thousands of years. But so I'm trying to kind of combine both of those things and a little bit of rites of passage stuff. I don't know if you've heard of the Arnold van Gennep's like theories of back in the day, and like I'm starting to piece it together. But from that one experience, I've aligned basically what happened with your experience of Jazz Freddy, because literally all the things show up. And so I'd love to ask you about, and I almost don't want to do it. It's kind of like counterintuitive. But I'm now, because that one really nailed it. It's ticked all the boxes. It's created a self-authoring human who's writing her own story, and now like that's how we can get exponential growth, and we can create these bigger conversations that need to happen around Australia and the world, and catch people on that Friday. So yeah, I'd love to learn. I'd love to hear from you what you think about the kind of reverse engineering of a group flow experience when you don't really want to. You only want to put markers in to try and, I guess, recreate it. And I don't ever want to recreate it because I want to improv. But do you know what I mean? Is that yeah, I guess that reverse engineering vibe. How do you take that?
Right. So yeah, you want to know how to make it more likely to be successful. Oh, just a minute. I realized I forgot to close my door. I'll be right back.
No worries.
All right, I'm back. So yeah, it sounds like you've read my book. You're talking about Jazz Freddy. You're talking about group flow. So that's the material I love, and my own experience performing with improvisational theater groups, and then also playing piano with those groups for about almost 2 years, and then videotaping the performers on stage, transcribing their dialogues, analyzing what happens from moment to moment while you're engaged in this kind of group flow. So that's, I guess, my contribution is that more rigorous scientific analytic approach, which, when I shared it with my improvisational theater colleagues, their eyes glazed over. They said, this is way too complicated. You're trying to make it more complicated than it really is. But I was I was trying to make contributions to academic literature and understandings of interaction analysis, what goes on between people when the conversation is flowing, what sort of conversational dynamics. And so, yeah, I'd say that's really my contribution, is to think about that moment-to-moment interaction, and then connecting it with the creativity research and the flow research of my advisor, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who coined the term flow for his studies of moments of optimal experience or peak experience. He referred to it as peak experience, or I'd say maybe even more often optimal experience. So what is it that characterizes that type of activity or that moment when you lose track of time, when the experience itself is its own motivation? You're not thinking outside of the experience. You're not thinking of any sort of external motivators. You're not doing it for a goal, right? For money or fame. And his, it became a major contribution to what now is often called positive psychology.
Yep.
Because this was back in the 1970s when most psychology was looking at dysfunction, or how can we treat people who have these various problems, like in your case, problems with alcohol. And his idea was, well, let's look at what peak experience is like. What does it mean to be fully human? And I guess maybe one point is that it's not the same thing as fun, and it's not the same thing as relaxing. So you're not sitting on the beach not doing anything. You're highly engaged and you're expending a lot of energy.
Yes.
So that I started to notice when these improvisational theater groups, when the performance was more effective, and by effective in this case, they are performing for an audience. So they're creating some sort of performance that's dramatically coherent, that it has a flow, it has a narrative structure, it's not completely random, it's not chaotic. That would not be interesting for an audience. I don't know, maybe for some avant-garde theater audiences, they might enjoy something totally random as long as it had a certain aesthetic to it. But, this is a regular audience. And so, they are trying to create an effective performance for an audience. That's one thing that I think is different from these groups and for most of the groups that you and I tend to be in. But I think having that need results in what I identified as maybe the more generalizable features of what's going on, is that there's always this balance between the freedom and flexibility of pure improvisation, but on the other hand, there's a guiding structure. There are a set of principles or types of actions that members of this acting community, they've learned that these types of actions and behaviors are more likely to lead to an effective performance. And these other things that people sometimes do are less likely to lead to an effective performance. So that's what I became interested in as well. If I can think about, or if I can say something interesting about that tension, right? So what is the optimal balance for a given purpose of your meeting? What's the optimal balance of structuring elements and completely open and free-flowing elements? Because, and so I started then looking into the group dynamics literature and the teams literature and finding very similar things where the most creative groups do have some guiding structure that's determined in advance, and not necessarily just structure, but to some extent like a shared culture or a shared set of understandings about what it means to be part of this group right now. So improvisational theater, that community has similar shared understandings where you just have an attitude of acceptance. So when one of your colleagues or one of your fellow actors suggests a new plot twist or a new personality trait, once you developed a set of experiences and an expertise in this genre, you just immediately will accept this and build on it. Whereas if you're new to improvisational theater and you're not experienced, it's not as embedded in your natural way of acting. So you have to think about it more consciously at first. It's like anything. When you're first learning how to do something, you have to concentrate more consciously and focus on what it is that you're doing. And as you become more experienced, you gradually internalize it. It becomes more automatic. So I guess I'm sort of rambling here, but so one point, I'll summarize. One point is the importance of balancing the freedom and flexibility with structure. And then I guess I haven't said anything yet about what type of structure, what types of structuring elements are going to be more likely. Not all structures are going to be useful in ways that they guide the freedom and improvisation side. But there's that tension. The second thing I brought up was the role of structures and even a cultural understandings, implicit cultural understandings of what it means to be a member of this group and what it means to be contributing to and supporting something that we don't even necessarily have to think about consciously. And that comes from experience. You won't necessarily have that, probably won't have it right at the beginning. So if it's the first time for you as an individual to be participating in this type of group, then you won't really understand how it works yet. And so it requires there a certain kind of humility, I suppose, and some sort of willingness to be aware that you don't know and you have something to learn. And then as you're going through that process, hopefully you and the other members of the group with you develop that shared set of understandings. And as that starts to happen, then you're more likely to get into this group flow state. So at the beginning, you know, it's going to be, I don't know if I want to say more of an effort, but it becomes better and easier as you learn how to do it together. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm just sort of rambling on, inspired by the things you said.
No, that's amazing, mate. Like, yeah, thanks so much. Like, there's quite a few things to unpack. I think starting with you're totally right, and it's just dropped in for me now, is that a lot of the people that showed up to the Byron Bay event, where everything sort of dropped in really, really nicely. And when I say nicely, it was kind of like, it still took, 10 to 15 minutes, like you say in the literature, for everyone to really drop in, because or however long it takes, and you say by the second act, everyone's, whoo, bang, firing. But specifically the girl who's gone off and created her own, she's familiar with circle activity. Like that wasn't her first sharing circle, if you know what I mean. That some of the people who come to this you can tell, because, and for me, like, and I'm just using my own experience, first time I sat in a men's circle, I was like, nah, I'm not contributing to this. There's no way I'm talking about this stuff with these guys I don't know. But after psychological safety, after it drops in, that's when people start to open up. And even if they don't say anything, you can tell that they're totally engaged. They're a part of the flow. They're a part of this sum of one. And then I'm really fascinated by the tension moment, because I think there's like there's excitement in tension, but then there's also, I guess, like the tension of you bringing yourself up to do the thing that you want to do, which in my case is usually go a bit deeper in terms of like personal stories and how you've come out the other end, because those personal stories can be really cathartic, and then at the other end they can be really ecstatic, and people can see themselves in other people. And that's often why people share, because they hear someone say something and it's like, oh, I'm not alone. I thought I was the only person who felt that. But what are your thoughts on, I guess, the difference between tension on one side and then expansion? Because what I'm really interested in is I'm not out to create tension, but it's naturally becomes a thing. But at the other end, when it all comes off, that's where the expansion lives, and that's where the true, like, beautiful moments exist that allow people to walk away and not only feel different and not only feel supercharged and extended flow for some of them, but be able to carry the message forward and really become advocates for a shift in sort of the bigger thought processes of the Aussie drinking ecosystem.
Right. So yeah, there has to be tension and there have to be challenges. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And there is quite a bit of research in groups that shows when a group gets to the point where there's a lot of cohesion and everyone is on the same page, let's say, or sharing everything in terms of beliefs and practices and ways of being, that those groups are just too homogenous, right? There's too much cohesion. And when you're in a group like that, it usually feels pretty good, right? Because you are being reinforced by everyone else being exactly like you. Mm-hmm. And so you're affirming that I'm a good person because I'm like you and you're like me and we all get along. So then there's no tension, and people usually feel good about that, right? Yeah. But I would not call that a group flow experience. It's something more like at the beginning of our conversation when I said, referring to Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, being in a flow state is not the same thing as having fun and relaxing. Being in a flow state is effortful. If you don't have that challenge, then you'll just get relaxed and maybe even bored. So in a group setting, I think that same thing. And I don't know what it's like in men's circles. I do remember some of my friends doing this back when I was in my 20s. I worry that there could be almost too much of an effort to get to the point where everyone is thinking the same way. Or there might be tell me if this ever happens, there might be certain ways of talking or ways of being that are frowned on by other members of the group. So there's a kind of implicit or unstated enforcement of ways of interacting and ways of being in the group. I mean, I'm using unnecessarily pejorative terms. I think every group works that way. Either any sort of group or organization, either you set explicit principles for how you're going to operate, but if you don't have those, then over time you gradually develop unstated and implicit rules of behavior that I call culture, that becomes shared among members of the group. So one way or the other, you need some degree of that. That's what I'm calling structure. So you need some degree of that, whether it's explicit structure and rules or whether it's an implicit shared understanding that comes from just a cultural shared culture. And by that, I mean even small group culture, not necessarily Australian culture and United States culture. So it's a culture of a small group that develops over time. It's an emergent phenomenon. And that has to happen. And I'd say as the culture gets more and more shared, it becomes easier, and it becomes, I guess it's easier to get the work done that you want to do. And I guess my caution then is it can get to the point where it's so easy and so flowing that there is no challenge, right? You use the word tension. I'm not sure tension is a productive thing. I suppose it depends on what you mean by tension. I mean, if it's a kind of challenge, so a tension could be something that would help the group, move the group forward. Without the tensions and without the challenges, I guess I would say there's no movement forward. If everyone is shared and identical and all in agreement with each other already, I don't know. It seems like there's a certain kind of stasis to that. And it's not a bad thing when you get together, whatever it is, once a week or once a month, to reinforce your ways of being if they are productive and life affirming. And you're talking about individuals who may occasionally slip into more destructive behaviors. And without the reinforcement of your group, maybe that's what they need, is the same thing, as long as it's a good and productive thing. I don't know if this is resonating. I haven't studied this kind of group though.
It's all fascinating. And I think when I'm talking about tension, it's like intrinsic tension you feel before you are sharing something that can be quite vulnerable. And back to kind of like the structures of setting up the space. It is, and I've worked on this with my team through the Flow Genome Project. We're called Kokoro, and specifically with one of the ladies, Sarah Sarkis, who's a psychologist, and she mentioned so I set up the rules at the start, and they're only kind of guidelines, and it's basically like, we don't, what happens in here doesn't leave. It's whatever you say stays within us. Only one person speaks at a time, but you can, like, we are trying to get the yes and vibe, the roll on. But she suggests that, we ask, like, throw to the group, and we co-create the container at the start, because then it's kind of like it is by the group for the group, and it's an agreed set of rules, loosely stated rules. So I wonder, and the groups, just to be clear, they're male and female. It's just I'd sort of started them, even though one of them was pretty much a male group, and my facilitation techniques, and not being a super aware facilitator, and having only done 5 of these now, I didn't sort of realize that until after that the female in the group felt like it was just a men's circle, and didn't feel like she was comfortable to share. And of course, that is not a group flow experience if there's one person in there feeling completely apprehensive, in a state of probably tension. Not to say that wasn't a great conversation, it was, but there wasn't a collective. You didn't get that feeling at the end, and it's really easy to kind of to look back on specific connection time with people, and identify why, what was missing there. Like, it's a little bit mystical, but it's pretty obvious, right? So in terms of like setting up the space or setting up, what advice would you have in terms of, I guess, maybe building on the way that we're doing it at the moment, and just making sure that everyone is, I guess, comfortable and feeling ready to go to the best that we can.
Right. So yes, I see I'll have to stop in 2 minutes. So
Okay.
this will be my final comment. Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the gender issue, because I think it's a good example where men, when they're together, when I was talking about sharing a set of ways of being and ways of performing in a group. So men have a way of doing that. Men have an interactional style and a way of talking and interacting, which is unstated, implicit, and most men don't even realize they're doing it. So when you're with other men, it's very comfortable because you all, assuming you're from the same broader culture, but yeah, you know how to be men. You know how to talk with each other as men. Women, as a general rule, have a separate way of being or way of talking. So when all women are together, they're enacting a particular kind of female culture. And I mean like a public performance of self, like an Irving Goffman, or an interactional style. So I've been in settings quite often in the School of Education. It's predominantly female. So I've been in quite a few settings where I'm the only man. And it's actually my way of being as a man does not work because it would either interrupt the flow, or it would be perceived as rude, or it would just be not understood because the subtle implicit messages are different. So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to make a more general point than just about gender, but I think I'm referring back to my earlier point about the importance of having a shared set of cultural understandings. But also I was trying to point out that there's a risk in having it be too shared, because then it becomes too comfortable. And then maybe in this case, you're not consciously aware of what you're doing or that you're even doing it. I think that's a good thing, that the rules become internalized. And you, as I was saying about learning how to be an improvisational theater actor, you have to think a lot more about it at first, and then gradually it becomes implicit and tacit, and you can enact it without thinking about it. And now I guess I'm talking about the downside of that, is that once you have these shared unstated cultural rules, you, in many cases, you don't know you have them. And when you don't know how someone outside the group might perceive it. So I'm not sure what the lesson of that is. I think there is a benefit to having all men in a group. I think there's also a benefit to having all women in a group, but it's beyond my expertise.
Yeah, I think the one. Yeah, sorry.
There probably are people out there who are much more aware about gender than I am, but I just know it's something to be considered. But I have to hang up now.
Yeah, can I grab one comment before you go? Sorry. Could I just get like one sentence on what you think about the Friday Drinks Club that we've set up? Just because I'm cutting together a video for the guys in this overall sort of concept, and I'd absolutely love to cut in a comment from yourself.
But I don't know that much about the group. So.
Oh, sorry. Or just about I guess, like the concept I've talked to you about like, I guess you could talk about healing through group circles and the power of group flow within group circles.
Right. Yeah, the power of group flow to support individual members of the group is phenomenal. There's a relationship between each individual and the group. The group becomes almost like a greater than the sum of the parts. I call it an emergent phenomena, where it emerges from the bottom up, the individual members of the group contributing. And then when it's flowing well, you have something that almost becomes its own thing, and you all are contributing to it, and it becomes a wonderful thing, and it feeds back into the members of the group.
Yes, beautiful. And the wider society. And it can save the world, Keith.
And it can save the world. Absolutely. Nothing else can save the world. Well, no, that's not true. But okay, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'd love to connect with you again, but thank you so much for your time. It's been brilliant.
Right. Great talking to you. Thanks for getting up early.
Thanks, mate.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.